All right, so welcome to today's discussion about climate change in Russia. With all that has happened to our lives and to our world over the last couple of months, it's quite easy to forget that the topic of climate change has all but disappeared. But I think it's quite telling that Joe Biden, just hours after being sworn in as president, has moved to reinstate the US to the Paris Climate Agreement. And in his inauguration speech, he warned about a climate in crisis. It is beyond doubt that the topic of climate change is absolutely vital for all of humanity, and the state of our climate gives reasons for profound worries about our global future. Many of us will remember that the last summer was once again a hotter and drier summer than the historical average. Global average temperatures have been constantly rising over the last 40 years, and as a result of long-term climate changes, we had yet another summer with wide-ranging forest fires across Siberia, but also fires in California, Australia, and Scandinavia. If we look at Russia, these fires are particularly worrisome because they occur to some extent on permafrost soil, which contributes further to spiraling levels of CO2 emissions. And of course, forest fires are only one of the manifestations of climate change in Russia. And on the other hand, in 2020, in December, the New York Times published an article entitled "How Russia Wins the Climate Crisis." And in there it was argued that, I quote, "No country may be better positioned to capitalize on climate change than Russia." Examples given in there are the possibility to extend agricultural zones, as well as the possibility to use the Arctic for transportation all year round as the ice recedes. So Russia faces a somewhat double-edged sword when it comes to climate change. It is both heavily affected by the global changes in our climate, whilst some politicians believe that Russia can benefit from such changes. As Putin put it, we could spend less on fur coats and the grain harvest would go up. So we are going to discuss what Russians themselves have been doing with relation to climate change. We'll look at the most pressing climate issues and the role of the state in all of that. And for doing so, let me introduce our wonderful panel tonight. So we've got Arshak Makichyan, who is a climate activist in Russia. He's the initiator and coordinator of the Fridays for Future movement in Russia that is now active across the entire Russian Federation. He's 26 years old and has been a climate activist for a few years now. Then we've got Angelina Davidova, who is an environmental and climate journalist covering Russia, covering for Russian and international media for the last 10 years. She's directing the NGO Office of Environmental Information that is based in St. Petersburg. And she's also an observer on the UN climate negotiation process and has been so since 2008. And then joining us is Benjamin Beuerle, who's a researcher at the German Historical Institute in Moscow. He's been working on climate issues and politics of climate change in the late Soviet and post-Soviet period since 2017. Widely published in the realm of climate change, and he has a special interest in climate politics. So before we begin, I would just like to thank Nina Fries, who's been very involved in organizing this event and who would have loved to participate, but she has got other duties at the moment and can't be here with us tonight. And before we begin, I also wanted to let you know, as it's conventional, if you want to ask questions, please use the chat function and I will kind of collect the questions and address them to the panel. We'll begin by a moderator discussion now, and then we'll bring in your questions afterwards. So to get us started, I wanted to ask Arshak what the situation is at the moment in Russia and what you have been able to do on climate matters over the last, let's say, 2 weeks.
We were organizing an online strike, so like last year, and because of the pandemic situation, we were translating articles, trying to do some digital activism and doing some, trying to find some creative ways to raise awareness about this crisis. And I totally disagree about that Russia is gonna win the climate crisis. It's totally not true, because like our economy hugely depend on fossil fuel incomes. So, and Europe is gonna refuse from it. So soon we will have not just climate and ecological crisis, but economical and societal crisis as well, because Russian government not doing anything to change our economy. So Russia is a danger even more, I think, than other countries.
Okay, so you've mentioned, thanks Arshak, digital activism. Could you speak a little bit about what you've been doing in terms of online activism and whether you think online activism kind of allows you to reach a new public maybe and to reach into spheres that you haven't been able to tap in before?
Even before the pandemic, we were doing our work online and offline. And the most important thing is to combine these things because when you strike in offline, you can reach a wider audience, you can be seen, and you can influence politics. So yeah, during the pandemic, we were trying to learn how to do our work online better, and it was very important, but we cannot change Russian climate policy doing everything online. So I hope that soon we will be able to strike on the streets. But now, yeah, we organizing thematical strikes. So for every week or for every second week, we're choosing a theme related to climate and organizing campaigns about it, about just transition or about stop subsidizing fossil fuel corporation, or we're organizing campaigns about some local things in Russia because there are a lot of ecological disasters are happening in Russia, a lot of them the last year. If you know about the Norilsk disaster, if you know about what happened in Kamchatka, and most likely because of global warming. So we're trying to raise awareness about climate and trying to raise awareness of how it's connected with the climate crisis, because sometimes people don't understand it. If we will turn to renewable energy, there won't be oil spills, or if we will turn to more sustainable economy and try to fight climate crisis with the world, there won't be so much catastrophes like happened in Kamchatka. So we're trying to raise awareness about climate in ways which we can find. And the most important thing, what we are doing now, we're trying to support each other during these difficult times, because it's really difficult for activists as well.
Mm. And if we move back a little bit in time, kind of before the pandemic made activism so much more difficult, what would kind of a typical act would look like, a typical act of protest from Fridays for Futures in Russia? How many people would be there, and how do you organize your protests?
In Russia, it's different. Fridays for Future in Russia is not so huge movement like in Europe, because people are afraid to protest, and if you're protesting, you put in a lot at risk. So it's dangerous. Mostly we were organizing single strikes, because usually the government illegally refusing us for right to protest together, and we were organizing queues for single strike in Moscow, and we had strikes in different cities. Almost every week it was 5, 6, or 7 cities in Russia. And yeah, the biggest strike, I think it was on September 20, in 2019. It was just 700 people in about 20 or 30 cities, when in Europe it was millions of people. Yeah. So it's not like in other countries, but we are influencing the situation in other ways, because people seeing that there are some people who are striking for climate. Maybe I should read about it. And yeah, because in Russia there are a lot of other problems, people trying to survive. And if young people are starting to strike for climate, people starting to understand that the climate is about survival. It's not about our future or something like that. They're trying to be concerned about it as well, even though maybe they cannot strike now about that because they have to work or do something else. So it's very important that there is now climate movement in Russia, because before Fridays for Future, there was no climate movement in Russia.
Okay, Angelina, let's move to you. After we've talked about the social movement side, could you bring in a little bit more I would say the more institutionalized forms of involvement on climate issues, since you've been involved in that field for so long? Who are the key actors, and what themes do they tackle?
Well, in addition to what Arshak has been telling us about the Fridays for Future in Russia, There are also a number of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, who've been working on climate-related issues for quite a number of years. I would mention WWF Russia, I would mention Greenpeace Russia, also a number of regional NGOs, which sometimes work on particular aspects of climate-related topics. That would be renewable energy, that would be energy efficiency, that can be climate adaptation. Another interesting example, I think, is their organization, which is kind of a network of many regional NGOs called Russian Socio-Ecological Union. And it organizes a meeting of all NGOs working on climate agenda in Russia once a year. And this is when Russian NGO community is coming up with a joint position on climate-related issues, be it international agenda or be it Russian domestic agenda. And that position is then being taken to the UN climate negotiations, to the Conference of the Party, which usually takes place in November and December. And this is where they present it there.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. And now let's move not only in time, but also back a little bit in time. Benjamin, you're a historian. I would like to bring you in. Can you speak a little bit about when the topic of climate change emerged in the Soviet Union as an issue for activists? Kind of what were the waves when people got involved, and what were kind of the triggers back then?
Well, I would have difficulties to speak really about climate activism in Soviet times, but it's interesting for me to see as a researcher and historian how climate change as an issue appears at some point in the discussions about the environment. And that is pretty much the case from the 1980s, basically. So I just to name two examples from my own research. The first one was a campaign against exhaust emissions, so against car emissions in Vladivostok, which was led by basically activists of the semi-official All-Russian Society for Nature Protection from the late 1970s until the end of the Soviet Union. And in 1985, you had an activist of this organization who was also a state functionary and who in an internal document was warning, among others, that if we don't reduce further car emissions, we have a problem because notably also climate change will occur and there will be a rise in sea levels and this will endanger a lot of people on Earth. So this is in 1985. Very interesting for me to see how this is in the discussion. And again, in 1988, from another file I was researching, was the Soviet Renewable Energy Program, which was started in 1981, a big renewable energy development program. You had a participant of this program in 1988 publishing a document explaining the program to the public, and in the introduction saying, we need to do this, among others, because global warming is happening. It's happening because of human emissions, and it's endangering, again, the sea rise level and endangering many people. So in both cases, this is in the discussion, whereas in both cases, I would argue it's not the primary concern of these activists or of these actors, right? In the one case, it's really reducing emissions on a local level, and the other one also is about reducing emissions and hastening the energy efficiency and various other issues. But there is a certain awareness already in the 1980s at the latest among these actors that climate change is a real danger and is related with human emissions.
Okay, thank you. Then let's move back to Arshak again and back to the Fridays for Future movement. Arshak, you've already sketched a little bit how difficult it is, how dangerous it is to be an activist in Russia these days. What drove you into becoming an activist and being involved in the climate issues?
I have read about Greta Thunberg strike on Twitter, on Greenpeace International Twitter, because I was learning English. And yeah, I didn't know anything about the climate crisis before that, and I did know about the plastic pollution or like obvious things like this, because there are a lot of NGOs writing about that, but like even Greenpeace Russia was afraid to write about climate because they were thinking that people won't understand that people are really in Europe striking for climate, because there is no education, like there is nothing about climate in schools or universities, especially if you have a musician, and so I started to read about it and try to understand it. And then when I understood that something huge is happening and there is no discussion of it on a large scale in Russia, I decided to start my weekly strikes. And a bit later we started to organize Fridays for Future movement, because one person can influence the situation, but we should unite to change it, because we need unite people for this.
Okay, so the benefits of learning a foreign language, that's marvelous. And can you speak a little bit about, so Fridays for Future in Russia now, in which regions are you active? Kind of how many people are involved? How much is it centered on Moscow? Can you give us just a feeling for where the movement stands? Because as you already said, it's so different to what one associates with Fridays for Futures in, a country such as Germany.
Like we have activists from Moscow to Vladivostok, and we are a grassroots movement. So, and it's quite difficult to know how many people there are because it's grassroots movement. And as I said, the biggest strike was for 700 people, but of course there are much more people supporting us and much more people following us on social media, but most of them afraid to strike, or we don't have opportunity to strike, because on the global strike in September 2019 in Moscow, they refused us a right to gather together, and it was quite difficult to organize a queue for a single strike. There were about 70 people, like it was even dangerous. There were some people from some secret services or something like that. It was strange and dangerous. So in Russia, of course, it's not a big movement, as I said, and but we had activists from Moscow to Kaliningrad to Arkhangelsk, and there are a lot of cities in our movement, and we trying to strike in different causes. And like when there was declared a state of black mode in Krasnoyarsk, we organized strikes in solidarity with Krasnoyarsk, and Greta retweeted about our strike, and then even Krasnoyarsk government somehow answered to our strike, even though it was not so big. And so the influencing situation, even though we're a small movement in Russia.
Oh, it's interesting what you say about, even though you are a small movement, this international connection also means that at certain points, at least, it can be amplified, and your audience can become much larger than Krasnoyarsk inhabitants, for instance. Okay, Benjamin, you've already mentioned who the first actors were in the 1980s when the issue emerged. Could you speak a little bit about that over time? If you look at this, who were people who were involved in climate change? Where did the issue, where the consciousness for that issue emerged first in the Soviet Union? Was that a kind of rural, urban, middle class? Who were what is the profile of the people who had an interest in this at first?
Well, obviously, the first people who had an interest in this were scientists, right? And because really the Soviet Union was, or the Soviet scientists were leading in climate science, together, of course, with Western scientists. But if you think about Budiko, for example, Mikhail Budiko, who was one of the first scientists who developed and founded the theory of anthropogenic climate change, basically, and global warming going on. So this was, and then you had the actors I mentioned. So these were really, also scientists, engineers, in the case of the Renewable Energy Program, or also state functionaries in the case of the activists I mentioned in Vladivostok. So in terms of the urban-rural divide, I couldn't say a lot about that, I have to admit, just because I haven't studied it in detail. But as far as I can see, at least if you think about environmental activism and in a larger sense and not limited to climate change, of course, that was present both in rural areas and in cities, although I would probably argue that the climate change topic probably was sort of more important in urban areas for urban activists to some extent. But that's to be investigated further about this urban-rural divide. But so basically, people from various professions, and as I said, or I have to underline it once more, maybe two points very shortly. The first, I couldn't really talk about climate activism in this period of the 1970s and 80s because other issues were more at the forefront. And the other point, which I think is very important, at least for my own research, is that you don't have to be a climate activist as such in order to fight climate change.
Could you elaborate just on that a little bit? What you mean by that?
I mean by that you can, and that's important for many also post-Soviet environmental organizations in Russia. You can fight for reducing emissions on a local level and a regional level. You can fight for sustainable forests, etc. And this is all, and without having in mind in the first place climate change. But it is of course very much, these issues are very much related if you think about the causes of climate change with climate change. So you don't have to have it as your primary goal in order to sort of contribute to the fight against climate change.
Right. No, that makes perfect sense. I mean, it's such a kind of large and complicated issue entangled with many other arenas that you can have various goals and make a contribution in a way to climate change. So we've talked about activists and people who are involved, but of course, and maybe particularly in Russia, there's also kind of the big group of people who have whatever opinion on climate change and who are therefore potentially also a brake on kind of more action on climate change. And Angelina, I know that you've been looking at public opinion about climate issues. I mean, how important is the topic of climate change for Russians?
Thank you for this question. I'll probably start with saying that I've also been following public opinion on environmental topics in Russia for quite a number of years, and more recently also public opinion on climate-related topics. And the first thing which needs to be said is that over the last few years, we obviously saw a rise in environmental awareness in Russia. That happened due to a number of factors. Among those factors could be an influence of the global green agenda, increasingly better economic conditions, people more worried about their health, their future, their immediate environment. And that environmental awareness mostly was presented in the number of green grassroots campaigns, which appeared all across the country. And those campaigns took various forms. Like some of these campaigns were pure protest campaigns against something, say against the demolition of a local park or against the polluting enterprise. And some of these initiatives, they were more pro something, like they were trying, for example, to create a grassroots system of recycling in those areas where recycling was not possible. They were also trying to promote some elements of the sharing economy, zero waste practices, so quite a number of those. There were also quite a number of initiatives which were dealing with an issue of access to environmental information. I think Arshak has already mentioned the Krasnoyarsk case, and quite in a number of cities across Russia, groups of activists have established their own civil systems of air quality monitoring with buying quite simple air quality monitoring devices and then connecting them all into networks and putting all this data on maps. So we saw all of these trends probably over the last 5 to 6 years, and more people were getting involved in these trends. And overall issues of waste, zero waste, air quality, access to environmental information, general awareness of what is it around us, what is it that we breathe, what is it that we eat, what is it that we drink, has been becoming more relevant and more important. I feel like an important factor here was also the fact that most of these cases and most of these initiatives, they've been hyper-local or at least regional, and they were mostly dealing with hyper-local or regional environmental issues. Now back to the climate agenda. As I mentioned already, I started working in the sector around 10 years ago. And I remember that around those times, climate problem seemed far too abstract for many Russians and far too distant. Here, I would also say the situation started changing a few years ago. Even among the general public, there's more awareness about climate change. There are more concerns about climate change. And such events as the wildfires in Siberia in 2019 and 2020, they obviously made it into the news, international news and Russian news. And those are probably one of the factors which really had a huge influence on the public perception of the climate debate. So I feel like at the moment, the awareness for climate is growing. People are certainly more concerned about climate change and climate risks. They're probably still not fully aware what needs to be done. And many of them don't even believe that Russia can move away from fossil fuels. So I feel like many of them have become increasingly aware of the climate problem and of the climate risks. And but on the other hand, not many representatives of the general public know what needs to be done or support any serious political action.
And do we know if people would be ready to make sacrifices?
Well, here, once again, it's a bit difficult to speak on behalf of all 140 million people. The only data I can relate to is either bubbles around me, as we all have, where people are obviously very environmentally aware and they're willing to make big sacrifices. On the other hand, when we look at the available social polls data, sociological polls, we see that people are more willing to think about how they can maybe save something, like save energy or save water, or save other things, but they're still not willing to, say, buy something maybe more climate-friendly product if that would be expensive. So I feel like economic factors still outweigh many other factors, including like climate factor.
Okay.
I've actually wrote an article about it for the Greenpeace magazine in Russia a couple of months ago, analyzing changes in the trends. And if you're interested, I can post it in the chat. It's in Russian, but I believe quite a lot of our audience can actually read Russian.
Yeah, absolutely. Please go ahead and put it in the chat. And that allows me to move on to Benjamin, because you've also been studying kind of the public perception of climate change, and Angelina has already mentioned the hyper-local reality of that, and you've been looking at one space in particular, Russia's Far East, where climate change is already having quite some important effects. Can you give us some insights on what your research found, what the local reality of changing climate already are in Russia's Far East?
Yeah, well, I should say in the research I did, that was based on the one hand on articles I studied, or newspaper articles from mid-1990s till basically 2017, and the other source basically was interviews I led there with scientists and with environmental activists, and so what you can see is that the first point to mention really is, and that's some know, some don't, that climate change is happening faster in parts of Russia than on a global level in average. Among them in the Russian Far East as well. So it has already, if you look at the newspaper articles, for example, it has substantial effects. And what is to mention is, on the one hand, more extreme weather appearances like inundations in the southern part of the Far Eastern Primorski Krai, for example, around the Lake of Khanka, where regional scientists have related this clearly to climate change, that there have been these inundations in recent years or in the 2010 years. Then a substantial changing of the biosphere in notably this concerns fish species, because the water is getting warmer in the rivers in the region and in the Pacific region as well, which is affecting, among others, the life and this has been pronounced to me very clearly of indigenous people whose traditional lifestyle has been very much related with fishing. And also it should be mentioned because it gets warmer, there's also some chances to grow new plants in parts of the Far East. So some see this also as kind of an opportunity, which is there. But overall, I also in the manifestations I saw about climate change in the press and in the interviews, these rather negative effects nevertheless prevail.
Okay, the negative effects prevail. It's just some who perceive it as an opportunity, unlike the New York Times article.
Well, I mean, it's not to be doubted that because of the climate change, there is some in some parts of the Far East there is more possibilities for doing agriculture or more fertility or a longer period in the year where you can grow some things. But the question is, of course, what prevails in terms of the various effects. And so I have seen indeed more pronunciations, at least, of these negative effects I mentioned. If that is representative, probably you have to do more research about that.
Okay, then let's move from the Far East again to kind of an overview of Russia. And I wanted to ask Angelina, kind of since you've been observing that topic now for 10 years, I mean, in your mind and looking at the development also over the last decade, I mean, what do you think are the most pressing climate issues in Russia, and how have they already manifested themselves in the reality, in kind of everyday life for people?
Well, I would divide those issues into two main groups. And the first group would be physical risks and negative consequences of climate change, which are either happening now already or are predicted to happen in the future. And among those, I would certainly mention warming Arctic. I believe Benjamin has mentioned already that the Arctic is warming 2.5 times quicker than the rest of the world. Then melting permafrost. That is obviously not only Russia's concern, but it's also a global concern. For Russia, to mention a few other risks and threats, I would certainly mention wildfires. I would certainly mention growing number and severity of dangerous weather conditions and dangerous weather events. Those could be floods, those could be storms, and it varies from region to region. Those could be also issues with water and deficit of water in the southern and southwestern parts of Russia. Those are also the most developed agricultural regions in Russia. So quite a number of consequences, and these consequences are usually quite well analyzed and researched within the Russian science community. Now, the second group of risk, and this is also something which Arshak has already mentioned, are risks relating to decarbonization efforts of other countries. And here the threats come into the group which unites risks resulting from other countries buying less of Russian coal, gas, and oil in the future because of their decarbonization policies, which obviously pose quite a threat to the Russian economy, heavily dependent on revenues from those sectors. And another risks can be, and that has already become very important topic this year, and those could be potential trade regulations, new standards in trade, new border taxes relating to carbon footprint. Here, the first example would be plans of the European Union to introduce carbon border adjustment mechanism as part of the Europe Green Deal plan. And this is something which has been discussed within Russian business community very intensively and very emotionally over the last half a year. This is also something which I've been following.
Okay, thank you. And Arshak, I guess the same question to you, kind of different perspective, of course, as an activist. In your mind, what are the main kind of components of the climate crisis in Russia? What's the most pressing problem?
It's like everywhere. Climate crisis is about everything. It's about justice. It's about human rights, because there are more vulnerable people to the climate crisis than people who live in Moscow or big cities like Moscow. So climate crisis is about everything. And the most dangerous thing that people in Russia don't see that the change is coming. So the world is changing and we are not. So, and we are not from another planet. And if we want change, we will have a lot of other problems. So the biggest problem is, as I think, it's the climate awareness, that people don't understand that something is changing and we should change, because if we don't, then we will have a lot more problems than we have now. So, and of course, we're trying to educate people about things and to connect climate and forest fires, to connect climate and human rights and everything.
Okay. All right, let's move to kind of the role of the state. Benjamin has already mentioned the kind of leading role of Soviet scientists in climate research. And for some, that might be a bit of a surprise, because kind of climate action is usually associated with Western leadership in the public perception. But Benjamin, I know that you've been looking at the role of the Soviet Union, also kind of historically its role in international climate diplomacy. Could you say a little bit how you would assess the USSR's role in terms of climate?
Yeah, I would really say that, and that, as I said, I already hinted at, that in some sense, the Soviet Union was really a leading power in this regard as well. In the sense that in many discussion fora in the the World Meteorological Organization, in the 1980s, the UN Environmental Program, in YASA, the International Institute for Applied System Analysis in Vienna, these were all fora where climate change was discussed, and the Soviet Union sent, or the 1979 First World Climate Conference, a big event where in all these fora, the Soviet Union sent large delegations and was very much involved in the discussions about climate change happening. And scientifically, one more important point to mention is the Soviet American Working Group on Climate, where also climate change was discussed very much from the 1970s till the end of the Soviet Union. So it's interesting to see in internal documents that climate change as a political topic was sort of seen as, nevertheless, as a Western agenda more by the Soviet actors who discussed this in the internal documents. But it was clear to the Soviet actors as a superpower that once this was a point affecting the whole world, there was an ambition to play along and to play a leading role in this regard as well. So, for example, as well in the IPCC, the International Panel, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was founded in 1988. One of the three working groups was led by a Soviet scientist.
So Benjamin, you are one of the rare historians who also looks at the present. So tell us, what happened then in post-Soviet Russia? I mean, the leading role, it's hard to associate Russia with the leading role in tackling climate change. And given what you've just said about the kind of Soviet, one could have expected a different Soviet legacy to exist in post-Soviet Russia.
Yeah, and it's striking for me, and I'm still struggling with it, how this leading role, which was sort of had its ambivalences, because as I said, it was more seen as a Western agenda, etc., but was then interchanged by a very underrepresented role, I would say, of post-Soviet Russia. You see it in 1992 when this big Rio Earth Summit, where the foundation of the current international climate change regime was led. You had numerous heads of state being present and negotiating there, and Yeltsin was missing. He just wasn't there. And then again at various other in the 1990s at many events associated with climate change, the Russian delegation was just very small and was, I would say, of course, there was this crisis of the 1990s, of the economic crisis. You have the loss of the superpower status, etc. But all this is sort of, I'm still struggling with a coherent explanation for the underrepresentation I see of the post-Soviet Russia in the 1990s, really, here, where you see just much less of an engagement and just much less of a presence even of Russian actors. And then, of course, one has to say, of course, that the Kyoto Protocol wouldn't have come into force without Russia's ratification. So then at that moment, Russia is there again, but it's not taking a lot of engagement in terms of emission reductions, obviously. And this has reasons I could talk about, but maybe you want to give more time for questions to the others. But we could come back to that if there's time.
We should definitely come back to that, looking at that reluctance. But I wanted to bring Angelina back into the discussion on that role of the state as well, and bring in one question from the audience. And maybe let's begin with that. And that's to look at the regions in Russia. I mean, is there a particular region that you would single out that stands out in terms of, let's say, climate governance or how it manages its natural resources, clean water and so on? Is there kind of, what's the mapping that one could do of Russia's regions?
Well, I'll probably split my answer into two blocks. So the first block, I would address the climate agenda and the regional climate policies, and then the second one, regional environmental policies. So if we speak about regional climate policies, regions in Russia do not have a lot of autonomy in the area of climate policies. Like, regions are encouraged to develop their own climate adaptation strategy, inventory of greenhouse gases, and also plans to decrease the greenhouse gases, so mitigation strategies. However, most regions still lack financing and expertise for that and just don't do anything. However, a number of regions have actually made some steps forward with that regard. I should probably mention Moscow. And Moscow is the only Russian city which is a member of the C40 initiative, which is an association of climate ambitious cities. So Moscow has been trying to draft its climate adaptation strategy. It's not ready yet, but it's being prepared. So at least also at forums which take place in Moscow, they speak about this topic. Likewise, in St. Petersburg, there was an attempt to draft climate adaptation strategy. And obviously the St. Petersburg, a city which is located at parts almost at the sea level, it's quite an urgent and pressing issue. And so the strategy once again has been drafted and it exists. However, it still has not been adopted and it still has not been integrated into any other socio-economic plans of the city. A number of Arctic and northern regions of Russia have been also trying to develop their climate adaptation strategies. Quite a lot of them within the cooperation projects with other countries, say Finland or Norway. And an interesting case here would also be a case of Yakutia, which was the first region which adopted a special legislation on monitoring and protection of permafrost, which is quite an interesting example, I believe. But overall, like, to sum it up, there are certain steps being made. There are more and more talks about it, but not a lot is being actually done. So I would probably summarize it like this. Now, if we go from here to the second part of the question, and that is environmental agenda, If I understand it correctly, the question in particular was about water resources, right?
Exactly, that was the question that came from the audience, yeah.
Well, if we address the water problem for Russia, I would mention a number of factors here. Well, first of all, Russia has the world's second largest freshwater resources after Brazil. But most of these resources are located in the eastern part of the country. So after the Ural Mountains, so to say, if we look from Europe, while most of population and most of water consumption is concentrated in the western part of the country. And most of water pollution is happening because of the old urban infrastructure. That would be wastewater treatment plants, which are out of date, and similar urban equipment. So a really big challenge for Russia now is invest enough in this urban infrastructure, which would then produce less polluting wastewater and releasing less of this wastewater into the rivers and into the lakes and into the seas. Here, once again, a number of international projects have been realized, say in St. Petersburg. Well, St. Petersburg is located on the Baltic Sea, on the Gulf of Finland. So this is why, with support from money from the Swedish development banks and other development institutions from Sweden and Finland, St. Petersburg wastewater treatment facilities have been renovated. So that was probably one of the good examples. And then Moscow has also invested quite a lot, but then Moscow is obviously, it's like the richest region in Russia. And they've also invested quite a lot in renovation of their wastewater treatment facilities. But then even if we look at quite a number of other large cities, say located along the Volga River, not many of them would have modern wastewater treatment facilities. And this becomes quite an issue also for the ecosystem of the Volga. I hope I answered some of this question. It's obviously a very broad topic and I could speak much more, but I realize our time is limited, so I'll probably stop.
No, that was great. Thank you very much for these very, very precise insights. And let's stay with you for a little longer, Angelina, because obviously one way for ensuring that kind of climate change policies are having an effect is you need to put the right legislation in place. And kind of just in a nutshell, I would say, could you provide us with an overview of what type of legislation is existing in Russia and to what extent it works or why it doesn't?
Do you mean legislation like climate-related legislation?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, right. So the first, like if you speak about the recent history, I would mention like the basic framework legislation was the Climate Doctrine, which is a framework document. It's more of a strategical kind, but it outlines Russia's priorities in fighting climate change, acknowledges that climate change is a threat for Russia. It has been signed by President Dmitry Medvedev at the time, around the time of the UN Climate Change Conference in Copenhagen, so in 2009. Following that, there were a number of other federal climate legislation initiatives. To mention a few, last year, Russia has adopted its first stage of the National Climate Adaptation Plan, which is once again very general, and but it prescribes particular measures which needs to be carried out, research, but also specific measures and policy measures which need to be carried out on the federal, sectoral, and regional level. After ratifying, well, actually joining Paris Agreement in September 2019, this last November, Russia has also come up with its climate target for 2030. I have to say it's very ambitious. So maybe just to give you a brief outlook. So this target says Russia should reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 30% by 2030 from the levels of 1990. Taking into account sequestration of greenhouse gases by forests and other ecosystems. Well, the current statistics which we have is that the current level of Russia's emissions are already -30 from the 1990 levels if we don't count the forests in, and -50 if we do count the forest in. So -30 actually means increase in emissions. And so this is on one hand. And so it's very ambitious, and it's been heavily criticized by environmentalists and also by, say, the Fridays for Future activists. Now, last year, Russia has also drafted a plan, low carbon strategy, a draft low carbon strategy. It still has not been adopted, but that strategy also does not foresee any year when Russia would be fully decarbonized. So like reaching zero decarbonization, like a full decarbonization level, is not foreseen yet. And overall, the strategy is also not very ambitious, but it's still being worked on. And then another probably very important piece of climate legislation is the legislation which obliges companies to start inventory of greenhouse gas emissions, and which also speaks about potential introduction of a carbon price, or a price on carbon. That piece of legislation has been worked on for the last 4 or 5 years. And it started at a rather ambitious level, with even like cap and trade system being written down into it. But then later on, due to huge pressure from the business circles, it got completely wiped out. So now it's very general. Now it's all about just monitoring and energy efficiency measures and the measures that support climate projects. Those are projects which aim at reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the companies, but nothing more specific, like no mention of any carbon taxes, or maybe something like carbon limits or quotas or emission reduction units or anything like this, like emission floor, nothing like this. The only recent news, which was somewhat positive, is that Russia is launching its first regional experiment on carbon trading and on limitation of carbon emissions on the island of Sakhalin in the far east of Russia. And that experiment, like, we'll see how it develops. But just a couple of days ago, a roadmap for that experiment has been written down. And obviously for Russia, energy efficiency is a huge issue, and the energy efficiency program has been renewed a number of times. Like Russia, I think back in 2009, it has already been realized how much energy Russia is actually losing. According to the estimations back then, Russia was losing as much energy as France was consuming. So there was a target set, which said 40% reduction in energy intensity by 2020. Now the target was not fulfilled. So instead of 40%, I believe we got only 12% reduction. So now there's a new target, which is again minus 40% by 2030. And like the Minister of Economics, they recently made a presentation of their new plans for energy efficiency. They think that if all the energy efficiency plans in Russia are being carried out, that can help Russia halve its emissions. So bring down the emission level by half. So that would be probably the overview of the most important documents in the area of climate-related legislation.
Okay, thank you very much. Just a quick follow-up, because it was a question that came up that someone in the audience mentioned. Nino wanted to know specifically about the Paris Climate Agreement. Is there anything you would like to add on what you've already said, and whether that had any implications in addition to what you've already said?
That already. Yeah. Like Russia has submitted its NDC, so its climate goal under the Paris Agreement last November. Russia is working out its low carbon development strategy, which is not very ambitious. Russia has approved the first stage of its climate adaptation plan and is working out further climate legislation. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Well, or not so great, but let's move over then to Arshak and look at the other side, I guess, a little bit. Arshak, you've already mentioned that the Russian state is certainly not a partner of your movement and not supportive at all. And maybe you could kind of bring a little bit kind of some details into that. In what ways, or what are the most significant obstacles that for climate activism that come from the side of the state and that you've kind of had to confront yourself?
Actually, it's again everything, because when the law don't work in Russia. Like everything can happen if you're doing any kind of protest. And like if now it's bad, the government is going to organize a lot of more new prohibitions. Like there are new laws about prohibiting educational activities or something like that. And they have new laws about they can now declare any person a foreign agent, even like I'm talking with you and they can declare because of that me a foreign agent or something like that. And there are new laws that trying to like prohibit our human rights in Russia. I don't know. So it's actually it's getting worse and worse. But of course, at the same time, people starting to see that it's not okay that like we are people, we have some basic human rights and we can do whatever we want to do because yeah, it's natural. And people starting to be angry. And when something happening and some disaster or something like that, everyone discussing it and everyone is starting to demand something from the government. So it's complicated thing.
Okay, so the legal restrictions, but at the same time, kind of a certain change of consciousness. I mean, the one event that has occupied kind of more or less all of Europe and not so much the Russian media sphere is obviously the poisoning of Navalny and his return. I mean, that must have had a huge effect also on kind of people who are active in climate change issues. I mean, what has that triggered amongst you, for instance, and your friends, and how you think about what you should be doing? Have you become more prudent and anxious in your activities, or what has been the Navalny effect on people like you?
Now all young people are quite angry, and I'm not sure what will happen on Saturday, but I think it will be something big. So after that, it's quite difficult to talk about to having a dialogue with the government because they breaking the laws, they killing people, they then jailing them for not being killed. Or so it's so insane that they behaving so stupid and strange that you cannot like they losing their legitimacy or whatever. So like I like other people getting angry at them and like we want them to resign or whatever. And so it's now quite difficult in Russia with that. And all Russia is discussing Navalny poisoning. And after that, there was investigation about $1 billion castle or whatever of Putin. So it's another issue that we're discussing because I think they spent less on climate action than on one castle, or what is it, the castle or home, I don't know. So corruption is, of course, is a very important issue for everything because you're saying that people should change their habits or do something to reduce their emission, but about I'm not sure, but about 40 millions of people living in Russia about the poverty line, so they do not emit a lot of carbon emission. And there are a lot of very, very rich people, they spend a lot of money and it's some social issue, and people getting angry. And so I think a lot of things can change in like soon in Russia, and I hope that something will change because now it's unbearable what is happening, and the government reaction to everything what is happening, and like yeah, it's quite
at the same time that also creates a kind of dangerous situation for the government, right? Because I mean the levels of trust are not particularly high in the context of the pandemic anyway. And if the government is perceived as failing to react on climate change, I mean, that will further increase or decrease levels of trust and increase the distance between society and state. And certainly the revelations about the palace have not helped. Arshak, you've already mentioned the law on foreign agents and the extent to which this is something that kind of makes activism dangerous, more difficult. There's a question from the audience to elaborate a little bit more on how the new foreign agent laws actually restricts environmental activism. Could you speak to that?
So they can declare any person a foreign agent for everything. Like it's like very strange law, and after they declaring you should when you're writing something on the internet, you should write that you are for a foreign agent or something like that, and it's like not very democratical thing. Like it's very strange law. So there are not so many foreign agents now, but like about I think 7 or 8 years ago, there was a law about declaring foreign agents of NGOs. Now they can declare persons like me, not the movements or like NGOs. They can declare any person NGO for talking with people from abroad media or communicating or doing everything. So it's a strange law. It's difficult to talk about this law because it's not clear. Yeah, they can do everything with everyone. So, and if they like you breaking the law and you're not saying that you are a foreign agent, then you should pay some fines, and then they can jail you for breaking the law. Like
that is very far-reaching, yeah. And I imagine, Angelina, you probably have something to add on that, given that you are active in the NGO sector. To what extent has that law made your activities more complicated?
Well, I could add that quite a number of NGOs, mostly regional environmental NGOs, have been harmed by this legislation. And many organizations had to close down, get registered, or just start working as civil society initiatives or like grassroots initiatives instead of organizations. We'll still have to see how the situation develops, and I believe the risks and concerns expressed by Arshak, they're very relevant. So yeah, I'd probably say this.
Okay, right. And then there are a few questions already from the audience. There's one for Benjamin, and to the audience, you can just continue typing into the chat, or you can also directly say to whom you want to address that question. But there's one, Benjamin, I imagine you have things to say given the research that you've done in the Far East, and that's on the role of indigenous people in relation to especially conservation, but I guess also the general topic that we've been talking about. What has your research already shown in that regard?
Well, as I mentioned, obviously climate change is, from what I've learned, they're really endangering the traditional lifestyle of indigenous people by this changing of the biosphere I was also mentioning. So I have been talking, for example, to a representative of an association of indigenous peoples in the Russian Far East in Khabarovsk, and she told me that basically in her view, the indigenous peoples were the main ones, or she even said the only ones who are really concerned about climate change here. I'm not sure this is the case, because as I said, I have seen other people mentioning climate change as a problem, but obviously this is something which was there as a topic in her mind very much. And about activism in this sense, I couldn't talk that much about it. I know I have been in touch with another researcher who has done research on among indigenous people in the northern part of the Far East. This is Jessica Grable. And she told me what she found basically was that there was, in the same time, she found very much the belief that, yes, it's a problem that the climate is changing, but we can't do much about it. So this attitude, which was still quite widespread according to her research findings. So that this idea that yes, the climate is changing, but we as simple human beings aren't in a position to do much about it. That was apparently present. Mm-hmm. I should maybe mention, or just if I might use this occasion, because I think the melting permafrost issue hasn't been that much prominent so far in the discussion. I think it's a very important one. If you think, for example, about the Norilsk disaster, which happened in 2020. So really this, the fact that large parts of, and you mentioned it, I think, in the introduction, and Angelina mentioned obviously the melting away of ice in the Arctic, but the fact that large parts of infrastructure and houses in sub-central parts of Russia are built on permafrost and are endangered by this melting away of permafrost. I think is going to be probably an even bigger issue in the upcoming years. And the Norilsk disaster is probably something we just like a forebearer of what might be happening in other instances as well. And it was interesting to see that while this major oil spill, basically, or diesel spill, which happened there, and which was very much has been endangering large parts of the environment around it. It has been, according to first estimations of the local authorities, really, and even really related with the fact that just the permafrost has been melting away among. And so this oil reservoir has been crumbling because of that. So I think this is something we really have to mind regarding, and you mentioned it, but I just want to underline it as a topic which will probably come up even more prominently in upcoming years.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Benjamin. And it's obviously one of the global tipping points as well that will then just lead to a further spiraling of accelerated climate change. Just to follow up on this question on the indigenous people, you mentioned the kind of, I guess, resignation almost in your response. Could you clarify a little bit? Is that because it's maybe your response suggested, well, we are just small human beings, what could we possibly do? Or is that more related to what Arshak has been talking about, that, well, we are in Russia and we can't do anything because we don't have a system where we could find an echo with our views and what we would like to be done in the situation?
Well, as I said, I'm referring here to the research done by a colleague of mine, who did this research in the northern part of the Far East among indigenous people. And she told me that there was really a widespread attitude. She found that, well, the first part of your question, basically, that really human beings as such aren't in a position to change the course of the climate. So which is sort of and joining with a sort of climate skepticism, which is still, as I could see it, at least in the last 2 decades, has been quite widespread still, that it's not necessarily, well, climate change is happening. That is perceived meanwhile by a bulk of the population, I think, as such, but is that related with anthropogenic actions? This is still disputed. And in this particular case, I think has been related also with certain just traditional beliefs Jessica told me about how nature is functioning, and that human beings are not the ones who will alter the big course of how nature is functioning. That's, again, sort of in contradiction with what I found about when I was talking about with the representative in Krawatzek, for example, who told me that she was really concerned about, and she thinks that the state should be much more active about doing something about it. So there's obviously not a univocal position about it among indigenous people in the Far East, but it's important to have in mind that there are these various opinions. Yeah.
Angelina, would you like to add something on that point, given kind of your expertise across Russia on the kind of potential role as actors for indigenous people or their lack of agency?
Well, I feel like indigenous communities have been speaking more and more about climate change recently, and also consequences of climate change for their livelihoods, for their way of life, and also threatening their traditional ways of life. So yeah, and they've been speaking also more vocally about it on the international level, like a number of representatives of international and Russian indigenous communities have been coming to the UN climate change negotiations, and also in Russia. But then to what extent are they an important player in the area? Well, I would probably agree with Benjamin here. I don't have a feeling like they're being viewed as an important player. We'll see. It's also that quite a number of organizations, which were associations of indigenous communities, they've been also labeled foreign agents and they had to dissolve and disappear. So in many ways, their voice has become somewhat weaker. So we'll have to see how the situation develops.
Okay, well, let's move on to a different topic that comes from the audience and that allows us to bring Arshak again back into the discussion as well. And that is kind of the potential role that Western countries could play. And kind of to make it kind of fit your case, Arshak, I guess, what would you hope Western countries to do to support climate change mitigation in Russia?
Yeah, it's a very important question because like we have to be wise and to do everything together. And of course, Western country can support activists in Russia. Like when Navalny was poisoned, he got a lot of support. And when I was arrested, I got a lot of support. And of course, Western country can help us with technologies, and because we do not have really effective renewable energy technologies. And when the political situation will change in Russia, I hope that we will be able to do something together to change that, because we do not have really renewable energy in Russia. Like we have like 1% of renewable energy if you count in solar and wind. So we need to increase and to change our energy system because it's very ineffective. And yeah, and of course, I think we need more pressure on the Russian government because they're not doing anything on climate to decrease carbon emissions. So we need pressure, and we need, of course, I don't know. It's a difficult question, I think, because
and concerning activism, I mean, is there something that you think Western countries should do to support at least your voices in the country?
Yeah, I think support of activism is very important, and to support not just like feminist activists. Like yeah, I have a lot of support from international things, but we have a lot of other activists and from other cities, and I think they need their voices heard. So I think the Western media or governments should support everyone in our movements, and yeah, and the same thing, we need to pressure Russian government when something happening with Russian activists, because yeah, there are a lot of things that happening, like people from secret services calling to our activists and threatening them or doing things like that, and it's against international human rights things, and we need to people in Russia who are fighting for our common future should feel that they are safe, and they should feel the support of the people from abroad. So it's very important that people will talk about it, people will support us. So yeah, it's very important.
And Angelina, since you've been involved in international climate policies as well, I mean, do you see the climate, I mean, kind of given that it's a shared threat, as a potential area for cooperation, or is the issue too divisive, and at the end of the day we will not be able to agree, as some of your answers suggested, on an agenda, and therefore cooperation kind of will only be on a superficial level and kind of vague commitments that are even below the levels of emission that we already have today? I mean, what is your sense on the potential for an international cooperation on the climate?
I still feel it's an important topic to develop cooperation on, and also in various aspects, from science and research to particular projects, to technological cooperation, to a cooperation in the area of civil society, education, so many areas. I feel like it's a common good and it's cooperation for the better future of everyone. So I feel like this is one of the actually perfect areas of cooperation where we can put aside other issues and just think about how we can do something together.
And Benjamin, can we learn something from history in that regard? I mean, you've mentioned the kind of Soviet leading role in that realm. I mean, are there kind of historical samples that you could bring in that we could actually maybe kind of help us to think through the challenges in 2021?
Well, think again about this Soviet-American working group on climate change, which was operating from the 1970s, meeting annually, having an in-text exchange about the challenge of climate change until the end of the Soviet Union, and this amidst the Cold War. So I would totally agree with Angelina that this is really maybe the area for cooperation, which I see where it's so essential. I mean, the topic can't be tackled without international cooperation. It's very clear, and there is huge potential for cooperation in various aspects. And Arshak has mentioned some. I think the cooperation, for example, in the energy sector for developing renewable energies, which again, I know from the Soviet experience or from the Soviet renewable energy program, there's such a huge potential for all kinds of renewable energies in Russia, right? And if they were developed, and energy could be exported in form of green hydrogen, for example, if the European consumers, as we know, there's a big energy cooperation going on since decades between the Soviet Union and then Russia and Western Europe. If the European consumers made very clear that we want energy from Europe, but from renewable energy sources, and that would be a field to be developed, for example, and has been a topic, by the way, at these EU-Russian climate conference, which happened in December, where Angelina and Arshak were also present. So where there were these panels on hydrogen and on energy as well. So I think there is really huge potential for cooperation in this area. And if we don't come into a close and cooperative discussion in this file, where should we? I mean, it's really the field where this is possible and where new channels also of discussion can be opened, I think, because just as Angelina mentioned, it's a common challenge, and it can only be tackled if states and societies act together on an international level.
Well, and maybe with the change in the US administration, we see kind of maybe a changed international discourse as well, and certainly a higher commitment by the US. I mean, another theme that I think is important to look at is, I mean, in Europe at least, kind of private actors are also quite important in kind of tackling or in at least designing products that give the impression to the consumer that by buying that product, you are making a contribution to tackling climate change. So the market, in a way, plays a certain role, and it's almost fashionable. And some companies make that very upfront, that their products are doing good to the climate. How is that in Russia? And I guess that goes to all three of you. Are there companies that are setting on that trend as well? I mean, there is kind of a middle class in Russia that has the purchasing power and that maybe also has the values and would be ready to, pay a slightly higher price if these products are kind of contributing to a common good. Is there something like that developing? I don't know who would like to start, but everyone can probably speak to that. Angelina, you're on the top of my screen here, so maybe, do you want to go first?
Hey, yeah, I'll start. Well, I feel like here within the Russian context, climate agenda and climate-related actions have not been that relevant for the Russian business community for many years. But now we see the situation changing. And I would also say here, one of the main drivers are the plans, the immediate plans of European Union to introduce carbon border adjustment mechanism. So that many companies are now willing to do something. Another driver, and also the main driver, also comes from elsewhere, like requirements, say, of stock exchange platforms for carbon disclosure or requirements of foreign investors or foreign partners for companies to disclose how many emissions do they actually have, what kind of actions are they doing to bring the emissions down. So what we see within the Russian context over the last couple of years is that most companies have been thinking about it, like what can they do? Many companies started reporting about the greenhouse emissions. They've also, a number of companies started very modestly investing into renewable energy. And also the whole system of green certificates has just been launched in Russia last year. So this is something which companies are looking at. But here we still mostly speak about like large companies of energy sector, metal companies, steel companies, maybe fertilizers. So those are not really consumer goods. And it's also like most of consumer goods sold in Russia would still be from elsewhere. Yeah, so I would not think that like without consumer choices, as a consumer here, you cannot make that many decisions. Like you cannot still decide for green energy supplier because they're now available. I mean, you can still decide and invest into a solar panel or something, but it's still something not widely financially accessible. Otherwise, if you make it, there are very few decisions in your life which you can make, which would reduce your climate impact. I mean, there are more decisions now that you can make which would reduce your environmental impact. For example, less packaging, more environmentally friendly products, more locally produced goods. Like this also already becomes a topic, but maybe not so much within the climate debate.
But I guess it's a good point to link it a little bit to the kind of questions on environmental degradation. I mean, Arshak, since you've been speaking about, I mean, the state failing to act, do you think that kind of private actors, is there an alternative? Are there kind of signs of change in the market to speak to that increased demand also of the Russian population to be concerned about and to address climate and environmental issues? Let's take these two together for the sake of that question.
Yeah, I think it's very important, but in Russia it's a little bit different because business is afraid to do something wrong and to lose money. It's not like we have laws here and everyone can lose their businesses because of saying something wrong or doing something wrong. Like when there were protests like Black Lives Matter protests in the US, a lot of companies supported these values of people who supporting who are against racism and things like that. And when something is happening in Russia, like Russian business usually is afraid to support people, and even international companies are afraid to support values that they are saying are important for them. So I think we should change that. It's very important that international and Russian companies should support changes because they will lose everything, because if there is no future, they won't have money in the future. So I think it's quite obvious. So we should work together and do something together, and business should support climate things. They should support activists. They should stand against human rights violations like it happened in the US. So I think it's very important and we should think about it, of course. And like when I was in Berlin, there were a lot of vegan supermarkets and a lot of cafes, and there is nothing like that in Russia. Yeah, there are a few cafes in Moscow, and there is a choice in Moscow and in big cities, but there is not so much choice in smaller cities. So we should change that as well, because it's quite difficult to be a vegan in smaller cities or to do things like that. So of course, business should play their role to change the situation.
Benjamin, do you want to add something on the potential role of private actors in tackling the climate crisis?
Yeah, maybe two, 3 points. The first, really, again, the renewable energy sector, which I am sort of been studying in a historic perspective, where I really see something developing in Russia in recent years with, for example, Renewable, the company developing solar panels, which is active. And by the way, here again, the regions play a role because, for example, in the Far East, you have large regions which are not connected to the central energy net and where renewable energies are already very much competitive because you have their diesel generators and you have to transport the diesel to it. So instead of that, installing solar panels, that is very much possible. And it is done in cooperation partly with Russian companies and with companies from Asia Pacific countries, which are nearby. So this is one field where I see at least Arshak was completely right to underline that the renewable energy sector so far, or the renewable share in renewable energies in Russia is very small. But there is at least something I see starting to happening. And this includes businesses which are involved in the energy sector. And the other point is really, I think what Angelina and Arshak mentioned, I think these local initiatives in environmental matters for example, recycling waste, for vegetarian restaurants you have now in Moscow at least all kinds of vegetarian restaurants opening, or for cycling initiatives instead of using the car in various cities and regions. Of course, again, Moscow is very much running ahead in some sense, but this is starting to be developed, and these local initiatives and these local topics are, of course, very much related with climate change. I mean, it's the fact transport or how transport is or which means of transport we use. Of course, this has an effect on climate change. So I see these various environmental local initiatives also as something which is happening here, and where also partly business is on a local level is involved.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's good to have an optimistic note to almost bring us to the end. Just wanted to kind of give the last word to Arshak. You've already mentioned that next Saturday is going to be a big day of protests in relation to Navalny's imprisonment. Kind of keeping in mind that this is a public event, our discussion now, but what could you tell us a little bit about what Fridays for Future is going to do on the weekend and how you are going to get involved? It's a public event, just to kind of remind you of that again.
Like tomorrow will be the usual Friday strike, mostly online strikes because of the pandemic situation, and like we are politically neutral movement, so we won't write anything about the Saturday protest on our pages. But like personally, I'm going to go to the protest because it's my choice, and other activists going to decide whether to participate or not by themselves. So everyone doing their choices, and yeah, we are trying to unite people, yeah, because it's very important to have neutral politically movement in Russia, because if even Navalny will be our president, or not Navalny, someone else, we will continue our strikes because we need a power that can influence politicians, even they are good, they are not like they're not killing people or not, they are not corrupt, but we need to continue to put pressure on the politicians anyway. So yeah, we are going to continue our work, and we are going to fight for democracy as well, because it's very important.
Okay, excellent. And to everyone who is interested in following what Fridays for Future is doing, the movement has a very active web presence. You can find it on, at least I'm aware of, Twitter, Instagram, Kontaktje. There's certainly more, but you can kind of Google or Yandex your way around and you'll find information about Arshak and the movement. That's bringing us to the end of tonight's event, depending on where you are. Thank you very much to Angelina, Benjamin, and Arshak for your time, for your insights. That's been a really fascinating discussion. I've learned a lot, and I hope that you've enjoyed it as well. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you, and bye.